Colleagues, thanks a lot. Great to be with you. And let me just maybe tell you why I'm here and why I'm interested about the cyberspace as it develops. How the connectivity and how cyberspace is changing the way we are able to operate. And this again covers a couple of important issues. I'm here, for instance, to explore what is the frontier of warfare as we see war and violence entering the cyberspace and cyber capacities being combined with attacks on critical infrastructures, which have again huge humanitarian impact. So how do we think in terms of law, of policy, of response about war entering the cyberspace, and how do we interpret the Geneva Conventions and the principles of international humanitarian law in that new area? And that was the reason why yesterday I had a long discussion with Brad Smith in Seattle to further think about and discuss this idea of digital Geneva Convention. So this whole issue of weapons and war which are either digitally enhanced or where attacks, cyber attacks lead to humanitarian consequences is something of a core preoccupation for us, and of course it touches the very core of our mandate to support states in applying international humanitarian law, but also to help them think about rules and principles to assist and protect people as the warfare is technologically evolving. A second issue which we very much are concerned to discuss with digital companies here in the Bay Area is definitely to see how we can enhance our delivery, our assistance and protection work. And this of course goes into enhanced delivery of assistance, as many organizations have discussed that over the past couple of years already. But it also is about thinking on how we can use data analytics to understand the environment in which we operate, how we can use big data analytics to do new types of needs assessment, to understand what potential victim beneficiaries how they articulate their need, to understand that needs are evolving and transforming themselves, and so that we are operating in a very new environment in which cyberspace and connection and connectivity are fundamentally changing the way needs are articulated, the way we need to respond, the way we are able to understand the environment in which we are operating. And this is very much what I was discussing today with Salesforce and Twitter and Facebook, and looking at, of course, some of the challenges when you go into those territories, in particular privacy of data and protection of data, and what is the space of trust that we can establish in cooperating with the private sector active in this area. And then, of course, there is the whole issue of how we modernize and improve and transform an organization which has its protocols and standards and operational activities and how we project this organization into the cyberspace, which increasingly becomes an important area of work for us in the future. And it goes into how we transform our organization in a way so that it is ready to face the challenges of the future. We are at the present moment working on two
important strategic documents at the ICRC. One is the next institutional strategy, which should basically define the horizon on where we want to be in 2030 and how we want to get there in the next couple of years. And then at the same time, we are rolling out our second information environment strategy, which should support in terms of connectivity, partnerships, engaging with some of the issues and challenges I mentioned beforehand with the broader environment. And so I'm here also to explore, to think with those who can help us think about these issues in the future. So I'm curious through your questions and comments to listen to you, to have a couple of moments to discuss with you and see what your concerns are, what your findings are from the workshop, and where eventually your minds and ours meet. I'll stop it here.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'll ask you some of the questions.
Our colleague Joseph Gehring has been assigned to ask the questions on behalf of the group.
Yes. So we crowdsourced some of these earlier,
Okay.
Not with any digital technologies. We just did a round table. I made a joke last night, and I said that the table I was sitting on was the most interesting table I've been at. Now this one is the most interesting table. I didn't know I was going to speak to you today. So what I'd like to know is, and this was asked by a few of our colleagues, how does ICRC balance the need for modernization and the leveraging of new digital technologies with the risks that those may present in rolling those things out in fragile contexts, for example? How do you balance the innovation with the risk?
Well, we don't know yet. I think one of the insights in particular from today's discussion, but it was clearly building up in previous conversations, is that a lot of the opportunities of new technologies in humanitarian work has been shaped around natural disaster and natural disaster response. And natural disaster response is much more consensual and easier, and you find a much more easier entry point and much less pitfalls in using some of the cutting-edge technologies in natural disaster. You get easily consensus to build connectivity, to throw connectivity into a crisis situation, and this is all very different when we discuss conflict, protracted conflict, violence, warfare. And in that sense, my proposal and my point in our conversation to the digital companies was, we are interested to engage with you in a conversation about how we hedge some of the risks and how we eventually leverage some of the advantages in context of protracted conflict. My point is also that these discussions show that it's not about technology. It's about negotiating consensual agreements on what you do in a certain contested and highly politicized space. That's what ICRC has continuously done. But then the question is, what kind of technology can we then enter into that negotiations? In the past, the key area of negotiating a humanitarian space was about negotiating access and negotiating basically humanitarian assistance and protection work. The question is, how do we do that with some of those cutting-edge technology? We can't just transport drones into Aleppo when we don't have access to Aleppo. Those drones will be brought down by the belligerents within a minute. So you see that there is no tech solutions. We are just aware that it's a different type of sensitivities, and I think we need to build a consensual, we need to build an area of trust with the companies and who have those technologies, and we need to combine presence on the ground and knowledge of situations with all the kinds of improvements and abilities, and then we will have to negotiate through those risks and protocols. I think we are at the very beginning of understanding of what it means when we come with new technologies into those very protracted situations. But I consider we have an ability to continue to be a frontline operator and to feed back into tech companies what some of the dilemmas are, and then to find hopefully a way forward. What are the norms, the standards, the protocols to respect the confidentiality, the privacy of data? That we are really at the very beginning of even setting the agenda, not to speak about finding already the solutions. You see it, for instance, just to finalize, Charlotte, who is with me here, the Director of Information Technology at the ICRC, Charlotte has developed our first information technology strategy, which was very much a backbone strategy, building the connectivity internally, building the capacity of the organization to do what we do. And we are moving very fast now into exactly exploring the front lines, the transformatory needs, the presences, and this will be an issue of a political negotiation at the end of the day, which we are used to do, and which will need negotiating capacities so that we can advance and define those spaces and which indeed have a particular twist.
Thank you. That actually brings me to the second question, which is, even if we don't know what these solutions are, and we're not expecting to know, the question is about relationships. So you mentioned some of the technology partners, working closely with them to assess risk, right? How do these relationships get operationalized? What shape do they take in terms of what ICRC is doing with some of the technology companies that you described? How does this happen?
Well, I don't know, Charlotte. Do you want to come also to tell a little bit? Because I think I don't need to do a one-man show here. In particular, when I have a woman who knows much better. Do you want to give a couple of examples?
Thank you.
So I think critically what it is, where we have been looking is on a needs basis, where do we think technology can respond? And then working out exactly what it is we think is needed before we go to any tech company and they tell us what we might need. So we know the framework of what we need, and then we actually try to look and say, is there a technology response to it? And is there a company that we can engage with that would enable us to manage that project, but also respect privileges and immunities of the ICRC. So to give an example, cloud, everybody talks about cloud. We use cloud, we have a private cloud in Switzerland specific for the ICRC. But to leverage some of the big technologies that could be used globally would need a form of sovereign cloud. And so we've been discussing with technology companies to say, well, how would an organization like the ICRC, which has recognized privileges and immunities, be able to have the technological, legal, and operational firewalls in place that would mean that data stored on the cloud is not accessible. And everybody says, oh, it's encrypted, you have the keys. But then when you really look, how is that tested out in the long run? And we hold highly sensitive information on individuals. It's life-saving. So we cannot afford to put them in danger. So we have to look and say, well, actually, there isn't a technology solution that can be provided by a company now. However, think about a sovereign cloud company in Switzerland, where we have the strongest privileges and immunities, and we know that we wouldn't be challenged in the court to hand over data. So that's the type of dialogue where we say what you currently provide isn't going to be a solution for us. If you really want us to be able to leverage it, then there are certain conditions in place. And I think that's how we try to navigate our very specific requirements for a humanitarian response, and then how can we recognize our very specific mandate and our privileges and uses.
Maybe there is one thing to add, as we are here in a place specifically connected to Switzerland, that we are the first non-business operator which is a member of Digital Switzerland. And this is very much what Charlotte just mentioned, that we somehow really try to leverage the fact that we are headquartered in Switzerland, that we try to use immunities and privileges also to think on how these immunities and privileges can be leveraged in the future in a legal framework of a country which still is more trustworthy as a host of data than many others are. And I think I wanted just to appreciate and to mention this in that context.
Thank you. Okay, so less operational and more about norms. What are your thoughts on the potential gaps between bodies of law like the Geneva Conventions and the changing nature of warfare in terms of how it's conducted in cyberspace and these things?
Well, we know for quite some time, and it's not contingent to cyberspace, that conventions which have been adopted by states in 1949 are not easily just transformable, applicable in all their aspects to modern warfare. We have seen that emerge for the last 20, 30 years. So what the challenges we are looking at today are not fundamentally different from the challenges we had when we see sort of fragmented conflict, which we don't know anymore whether it is war or not war, international or even internal. We are in an environment in which conflict and battlefields and actors and strategies have gone outside the boxes that the Geneva Conventions have made available. But contrary to many others, this does not lead us to the conclusion that just trash the Geneva Conventions and let's build something for this new situation. To the contrary, we still believe that the Geneva Convention is the most important body of customary international law which reflects through ages and cultures norms of behaviors in warfare. And I think it is important to do more an interpretative work and see what is an understanding today of those principles that have been tested through centuries and cultures, and what does it mean for the cyberspace, instead of just saying it's not exactly what the Geneva Conventions say, and therefore let's just throw this away. So the discussion today, I think, is very much, let's look at some of the core terminologies and concepts in the Geneva Conventions, and then see in how far they give guidance and practical guidance to behavior in the cyberspace. What is actually the battlefield? What is an act of war? What is direct participation in hostilities? And therefore, what is the difference between military objectives and civilian objectives in the future? So I could go on, but I think the critical issues that we are working at the present moment is to go to the essence of this body of law and to see how to interpret it in this new contexts, and what is an intelligent understanding of this new context. And then of course we will have to do our policy work, which is basically to generate consensus amongst belligerents that this is an interpretation which is acceptable to the belligerents. And we know that this is a difficult task that ICRC has done over the decades and will continue. But I think that's where we are at the present moment. We look at weapons developments, at battlefields, at concepts. And we try to understand in how far these are useful concepts and practical concepts to put limits to war, even in this new kind of environment of the of cyber space, cyber warfare, cyber security. One of the critical issues, if you are legalistic, you always come into the qualification of conflict dilemmas. And of course, the Geneva Conventions as such is a body of law applicable in international and internal armed conflict. And we don't know anymore today what kind of conflict this is, and whether it's peace or not peace. A cyber attack on a health system has most likely deep humanitarian consequences. Is it happening in the context of a kinetic armed conflict, or is it outside that armed conflict? And what is the body of law, and what are the principles in which you are looking at? We are strongly of the opinion that if it happens in the context of armed conflict, the full body of international humanitarian law is applicable. If it doesn't happen in the context of kinetic armed conflicts, we have to discuss. It's a space which we need to generate consensus amongst belligerents and amongst the states in order to see what is acceptable as a normative framework. And I think that's just a little bit of a flavor on the kind of work that we are really trying to do. We also know, I mentioned weapons, the whole issue of artificial intelligent autonomous weapons is of course a big question for us, where international humanitarian law bases it conceptually on a responsible individual who acts or violates norms. And so what is the responsible individual behind the weapon which is autonomous? Is it the computer operator, the guy who writes the program, who is basically the direct participant in hostilities? Can he be targeted because he steers the weapon? And can he be targeted at any moment? So these are important questions which we are mulling over. We haven't necessarily found a solution, but there are discussions which try to narrow down the debate and to frame the debate. And I think it's important to have it exactly with regard to the legal frameworks as well.
Thanks very much for your insights. These were just some of the things that we were wrestling with today. Well, as yesterday, as you know, this is a two-day program of work that has included workshops and public panels. And I feel very optimistic, although maybe a little bit even more confused, as to the nexus between cyber civility and the humanitarian protection question, for example. So that's all the questions that we had prepared, and we appreciate very much your time today.
Well, let me just say, we are really interested to tap into your knowledge, your discussions, and to hear about your results, because it helps us think through some of those issues. And we don't pretend to have the solutions yet, but I think we have a pretty good knowledge of what international humanitarian law is, and we have a pretty good knowledge on what the challenges on the ground are. And if we combine that with your brains and your thoughts and your concept, this is hugely inspiring, and I think I'm encouraged to know that you sit 2 days to help us think on these issues. One point I wanted to highlight, which you just mentioned now again, a lot of the debate on new technologies and humanitarian action has been project and assistant driven debate and not protection driven debate. And I think one of the critical issues is really to put protection center stage. I think the other dimension will happen anyway. I'm not in a worry that tech companies and NGOs and the ICRC and the Red Cross societies and all these people will find ways to enhance what they do by technology. What is much more difficult is to think, how do we protect people? How do we change behavior? How do we ensure respect of norms in an environment which is rapidly changing? And I think this is the critical question which we ask ourselves, and very frankly is a little bit of a lobbying work I tried to do with Charlotte during my trip here, because I'm still a little bit sort of puzzled by the exclusive drive on tech solutions for assistance delivery, while the most important part of the challenges which we are is not to respond to needs or to mitigate the effects of violence. The most important challenge is to shrink the needs. And shrinking the needs comes from protecting people effectively. It's of giving them into their hands tools to protect themselves. And here I see an enormous potential of connecting people, building communities, building resilient communities through connectivity, which puts us into a completely new ballgame. And we start to see it in the field. I mean, we see communities with connectivity capabilities and much better potential to protect themselves, to inform themselves, to be literate on their environment, to be more savvy in understanding the dangers of war and violence in the environment in which they are operating. And if you can contribute a little bit on shifting this debate also to what we consider being essential, we deeply appreciate.
Yeah, we had some of those issues sort of in the center of the bullseye in our discussion today, and we'd love to share with you some of the outcomes of this program, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right, we'll take you up on it.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you.